Welcome to Community, the TV show. I'm Kathy Antunes, sitting in for Annette Sherman. You know, the history of a community is something that should be celebrated and understood. And here in Sarasota, we have a real treasure down in Osprey. With me today is John McCarthy. He's the executive director of Historic Spanish Point. John, thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, thanks for having us.
Now, I want to start out, you are a native Floridian, and that's actually a rare thing. Tell us about your
background. I
was
born in Fort Myers, lived on Fort Myers Beach for 7 years, and then my folks moved the family to Sarasota. So we've been here since 1968.
Oh, that is a long time. You went to school here, and you know, before the show we were talking about how you went to Pineview when it was brand new. Tell us about that.
Yeah, Pineview Old Campus up in Sarasota, Tamisola and Alta Vista. It was all portables, awesome teachers, awesome school, and I'm very happy that I took advantage of the opportunity to go there.
And you recognize some of these portables around downtown, don't
you?
Yeah,
still a few of those classrooms are out there.
Yeah, which is an amazing thing.
Yeah.
I had no idea.
Yeah.
So having grown up here, you went to college here, and then you worked for the county for over 20 years.
Yeah, I started working for the county right out of high school, actually, in 1979, and began working for Dottie Davis, who was the county historian. And then I was going to school at what they called Manatee Junior College at the time, and worked my way through Manatee Junior College, Manatee Community College, and then got my degree from Goshen College, Indiana, which had a home base here in Sarasota. And but I had the opportunity to meet a lot of the old timers, as they say, and people that had lived in Sarasota and their parents had been pioneers here. So I had a tremendous opportunity to learn about the history. And I had become fascinated with Sarasota history, mostly from a community standpoint when I was still in high school, in terms of who are these streets named after, and who are these people, and what are these big mounds of shell where the Native Americans lived, and that kind of thing is what fueled my curiosity, which led me to this job at the county working in what's now called the History Center.
Yes, and the History Center is actually out east of I-75,
right,
kind of tucked back behind the celery fields, and it's quite an archive, isn't it?
Well, it's back. It's on this side of the interstate, but it's at the end of Bay Vista. It's behind the EOC. It's behind the new EOC, and it is an absolute treasure trove of photographs, maps, documentation, all sorts of objects and records about Sarasota's history and Florida history.
So that brings us your time at the county. Now you have landed as the executive director at Historic Spanish Point. And for those who don't know where that is, maybe we can go to one of our, you brought some visuals.
Sure.
Let's take a look at the map of Historic Spanish Point, if we can bring that up.
Right, so Historic Spanish Point is in Osprey. So this is just south of, Sarasota Square Mall. And the point itself is a piece of land that juts out into the bay that was built by human hands, built by the Native Americans. And it's composed of thousands of years worth of consuming shellfish and then stacking those shellfish up in a very deliberate fashion to create this point that goes out into the bay. It's about 16 feet above sea level at the top. And it then became the home of one of Sarasota's first pioneer families, the Webb family, who came down from New York in 1867. A lot going on there.
So that's interesting. So the Native Americans who lived here, the true native Floridians, right?
Right.
So they actually were sophisticated to understand how they could create a landmass using shellfish?
Oh, sure. I mean, they were very sophisticated in terms of not only stacking these shells up to create, and you think about it, that gave them homes higher above high tide, above storm tide, gave them better view, gave them better breeze, which meant fewer bugs. So there were a lot of advantages to doing that. But it seems at Spanish Point that they were trying to get across to Casey Key, or at least pinch the bay more, which would have been a tremendous advantage for fishing. If you can imagine, this point juts out, and there's another point that juts back from Casey Key, and you've got a pinch point there in Little Sarasota Bay. So well, you string a net across there and just get all the fish that you need.
Wow.
And so tremendous seafood diet. And then they were also sophisticated in how they utilized shells, the hard shells, to make a wide variety of tools, jewelry, art, and other things, which really shows their adaptability and their creativity amidst a culture in which they were basically living in a paradise and lived that way sustainably on our site for 6,000 years.
Wow.
So that's tremendous.
Yeah, I'd like to take a look at the second image that you brought to share, and this is their actual community. So
sure.
you can tell us about
So, we know from evidence that the homes were around from where the post holes are in the shell, and then, we figured that they were palm thatched, which is how most people lived in Florida, even after the Native Americans. You can see the shell being built up, and then, of course, they would have had dugout kayaks almost, is maybe a better way to call it, from most of the evidence of most of the ones that have been found in marshes and muck areas. So for instance, at the celery fields back in the 1920s, they excavated a number of them. They look more like a modern kayak, about 16 feet in length, pointy at the ends, not blunt-ended the way a lot of people think about a Native American canoe. So very sophisticated wood technology as well.
Really? And so they created this peninsula, and for the public to come out and enjoy historic Spanish Point, is it open? Tell us what you
Sure.
offer
So
there.
Historic Spanish Point is open 7 days a week. We're open 9 to 5 on weekdays and Saturday, and we're open noon to 5 on Sundays. We're a membership-based organization, so a lot of our visitors are members, but a lot of our visitors are folks from out of town. And then, so we see about 25,000 guests a year, and then on top of that, we have about 5,000 to 6,000 area youth who come through 4th grade school programs. It's a curriculum-based program on archaeology or pioneer crafts.
Cool.
And we have a wide variety of events that attract people to the site as well, and then they fall in love with the history.
Yeah. So because the history, I'm from up north, as many people are, and we associate history often with the bricks and mortars. There's a building involved.
Right.
But Florida is different. Florida history, and it actually, I was surprised when I went to St. Augustine one Christmas to find that the first Europeans actually, because I always think of, Jamestown or Plymouth Rock.
Right.
But actually, was it the 1500s, very early?
Oh, absolutely.
The Spanish came to Florida.
Sure. And the Native Americans had lived here, we know, in Sarasota County for 12,000 years before that. And maybe one day we'll discover something older. But that's Little Salt Spring in Northport. Then you've got 10,000 years at War Mineral Springs. You've got this Manasota Key offshore site that's an 8,000-year-old cemetery site that once was on dry land and with rising seas is now inundated. Then you've got Spanish Point coming in probably between 5,000 and 6,000 years old. And then a wide variety of other sites that were occupied by Native Americans all the way up through European contact. But then you also have a lot of historic architecture that people don't realize. So downtown, if I were to take you on a walking tour downtown, I could show you buildings that are 130 years old. Most people don't think there's anything downtown that's over 100 years old. But actually now there are a lot of buildings downtown that are over 100 years old.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of history here and a lot of ancient history here or Native American history here. And Florida is just a fascinating place all the way around.
It is. Well, the natural environment's fascinating, but the history too. So tell me, why do you think it is? I've got my own theories, but a lot of times it seems like the history in Florida isn't necessarily preserved the way it could be, or isn't appreciated, or we don't have the same passion maybe. I know you do. But I wonder if it's because so many people didn't grow up here. What do you think?
I think a lot of the people that come here as visitors and then move here are actually fascinated by the history.
Okay.
I think that some of the folks that grew up around here, it might not even seem like history to them. It's just the way it was.
Yeah.
But we see tremendous interest from people from outside of our community when they come here and discover all these things about Florida that they didn't know about.
Yeah.
And so a lot of the folks really try to relate it to back home, which is easy to do because if you were to talk about all the people that were the pioneers of Sarasota, they all came from somewhere else.
That's true.
And so people came from Ohio and Maine and Chicago and New York and all these different areas. And so when people hear about that, it makes them feel a little bit at home here because they say, oh, well, I'm not the first person from Ohio to come down here to Sarasota.
Right, it is connected to where they're from.
Yeah.
Well, the first hotel in Sarasota was at Historic Spanish Point. We have an image of that, and if we could take a look.
So this is the point itself, and we're looking out to Casey Key, and you can see the original Webb house that was built in 1867, and then adjacent to that, what they called the dormitory, which was the first resort here, they ultimately called it Webb's Winter Resort, and that was designed for their friends from New York to come and visit them, because that's where they were from. But also, they started a pipeline of scientists from the Smithsonian and the Wagner Free Institute of Science who were coming to look for undiscovered birds, undiscovered shells, plants, fossils, human remains, all sorts of different types of things. And so about half of the occupants of the resort were scientists who were coming here to learn about Florida because it was undiscovered territory.
And this was around what time frame?
Well, this was started in the 1870s. So the Webbs moved to Osprey in 1867 from New York. By 1871, they're corresponding with the Smithsonian about these things that they're discovering. By 1874, there's scientists coming here, and the resort was up and running. We've got the guest books from the 1880s and the 1890s, and it was how Webb earned his living. When he first came here, the intent was to earn the living through raising vegetables and citrus. But then they discovered that it was more lucrative to rent rooms and take people out fishing and running a little resort. So that started tourism in the entire region.
Really? So, because a lot of people, I would assume that it was downtown Sarasota where we had our first hotels. But what you're saying is actually...
This is over 10 years before downtown Sarasota even existed.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Osprey, Myakka, Fruitville, Bee Ridge, Nokomis, they were all on the map before Sarasota.
Okay. Now, you had mentioned in talking about these sites that, and the mounds that they created and all, what's the impact of sea level rise? Because you had said one of them.
Well, the impact of sea level rise on historic sites all over Florida is that it is eroding all the waterfront edges of Indian shell mounds and other features around the state. We are doing documentation now along the south shore of the peninsula so that we can monitor the changes that are coming both through storm tides, boat wakes, and other impacts. And so we want to get a baseline. We're doing some vegetation to stabilize the shorelines there in a natural way, and that's really important. But another thing that's interesting is it makes you wonder, these Native Americans had lived here since, the end of the last ice age. So they saw the water coming in. And so maybe they were building those mounds up to kind of get themselves lifted up because they'd seen it before and they were preparing for the continued changes.
No.
So we know that sea level has come up since the first people settled in the area, and part of our midden is actually below sea level.
Is that right? Yeah. So one of the very famous, Bertha Palmer, right, was one of the first settlers in Sarasota with a huge Chicago connection, a very well-connected woman, wealthy woman. And you all have examples of her gardens. What's her connection to historic Spanish Point?
Bertha Honore Palmer came down in 1910, early in 1910, to explore Sarasota and was taken to Osprey. She fell in love with the site there. It said she fell in love with the oak tree intertwined with the palm tree, which is, we've got them all over.
Yeah.
And she ended up purchasing approximately 85,000 acres in what's now Sarasota County. But her home place was just north of what is now Spanish Point at the Oaks subdivision. That was the name that she gave to the home, the Oaks. And so she had a beautiful home there, which is no longer there. But all of her gardens were pretty much on the Indian mounds. And so we have her Jungle Walk garden, we have her sunken garden, we have her fern garden, we have Duchesne lawn.
Yeah, I want to go to the image of, it's the sunken garden, right?
Yeah, the sunken garden.
Okay,
and, this is one of the favorite places for weddings. You can imagine with the pergola, the sunken garden, the lawn there. And again, you're 16 feet above sea level, so you're looking out over Little Sarasota Bay from this location.
Beautiful.
And so we do about 50 weddings a year. And we have a lot of different sites on the property where people can do that, but this is one of the more popular ones. And so this has been restored. So this was built, all this was built in 1912 by Mrs. Palmer, fell into disrepair, and then when Historic Spanish Point was created as a museum, it was all restored.
And when was that?
And that was in 1982. We opened to the public.
Really not that old at all. It's pretty young as a historic
site.
As
as a historic museum it is, but of course it's one of the oldest sites in the county.
Sure, sure. So when I go there, what can I visit? Obviously these beautiful gardens.
Sure. Well, it's 29 acres of paradise right on Little Sarasota Bay. And so we have a number of trails, and they take you to the different historic structures and the different historic elements. So we have Pioneer Boatyard that's been there since the 1870s. We have a building from 1884. We've got a building from 1900. These were residences and also served as dormitories. We've got a chapel, one of the first houses of worship in the area from the 1890s. We've got the old packing house from the 1870s.
What's the packing house?
The packing house was where they shipped out all the vegetables and fruit.
Oh.
And so it has a dock. It's out to deep water. And they would have sold the fruit to Cedar Key and Key West. And they had a schooner, and they would take and load it up with citrus and sweet potatoes and watermelons and probably some pigs and other things, and take it off to those markets, which is how you earned a living.
So this was a commercial center, a religious center, cultural center.
tourism center,
yeah.
science center. It's an amazing place. A
It is
lot has
amazing.
happened. And then for Mrs. Palmer to come in, and at a time when most people were selling the shell for Indian mounds to the road builders to build hard roads, she built her gardens all over them, and that's what preserved them. And then the family was involved in the donation of the property so that the Living History Museum could be created and it can all be preserved for the community. So that's a tremendous legacy that goes well beyond her years on the site, that continues through multiple generations of her family.
Yes, and wasn't there a schoolhouse on the site too?
Oh, and then
Am I
there's the
right about
schoolhouse out on 41, the old Osprey School from the 1920s. That's our visitor center. That's where everyone enters the site, comes on
Okay.
in there. And we've got classrooms in there as well that are used by a number of community groups and us as well for our programs. And so yeah, we got the school, we got the post office, we got the cemetery, the chapel, the boatyard, the houses. We pretty much preserved most of the original heart of Osprey on one little piece of property that's open 7 days a week.
So if I wanted to just go out, because the grounds look amazing,
Yeah.
is that something that people can just go and tour the grounds? I mean,
Yes.
because I asked you, do people exercise there? And
Well, we
It's-
have people that come almost every day to walk the trails. We're also dog friendly, so they'll bring their dogs. But we have, you can tour yourself with a nice map that shows you everything you want to see. And then we also have docent-led walking tours, very knowledgeable volunteers who give these tours. We have tram tours. If you're a little bit mobility limited, we'll get you on a little golf cart and take you out for that. And we have our boat tours in the Magic, which are exceptionally popular and that give you a different perspective on the property when viewed from the bay. So there's
Okay.
all sorts of ways to interact on a daily basis, and then we have events.
yeah, let's talk about those events,
Sure.
because one of them really caught my eye. It's a fairy and gnome.
Well, it's a fairy and
festival?
gnome house festival, and we've been doing this for 7 years, and it's really for the children and the families.
Okay.
And so both adults and youth will build fairy houses out of sticks and twigs and moss and all sorts of cool things, and they'll just use their imagination. So part of it is the contest, and then those are judged, and they get awards in the adult category in high school and then younger. But we turn the whole place into a fairyland. And so we see about 1,000 people per day. It's a 2-day event. This year it's happening on Leap Day on February 29th and March 1st, but it's always that same weekend, that first weekend in March. And it's been a really successful event. It's a great way to bring people to the site who aren't necessarily coming for the history, but then they discover it.
Yeah.
And if you could imagine fairies kind of dancing in the pergola there with the columns and everything out on Mrs. Palmer's
Well, it
sunken
actually
garden.
looks like
Yeah.
a perfect place for that sort of thing,
Yeah.
to have your imagination run free.
Yeah.
So the Fairy and Gnome Festival, that's every
year,
March.
and typically the first weekend in March, and it just so happens that this year that last day of February is slipping in there. It's
Yeah,
a
Leap
Saturday and
Day.
a Sunday event, but folks have a good time.
Okay, and then what other annual events are there?
Yeah, so we do an annual spring luncheon, and that's held at Michael's on East. That's a fundraiser for Spanish Point. We always try to have a theme and a really powerful speaker. So last year we had Alma Johnson from Sarasota Honey Company, because we're growing our own honey, which again is like a 150-year tradition at Spanish Point, but we're partnered up with her. And it was called Bedazzled, and everybody loved it. It was all about bees, and we had bees in Michael's on East. Well,
And
this year...
bees, bees are actually somewhat threatened now, aren't they? We
Well,
need to be supporting the bee
bees are up against
population.
it, and yet we're so dependent on bees. And so the whole presentation that day was Alma explaining what's going on with the bees, how she handles bees differently than other commercial folks handle bees, and that there's a lot of hope out there for bees. That's the good news.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of things that are occurring that's not good for them as well.
Well, we need them to pollinate our food.
Yeah. So that was last year's theme. This year's theme is actually, we have Paul Backhouse, who's the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the Seminole Tribe of Florida. And Paul's going to come and tell us about everything that they're doing for historic preservation, both on the reservations in Florida, but also through the southeast U.S., because the Seminole Tribe has territorial homelands and a big influence on how historic preservation is unfolding in Native American Indian country. And so he's going to come and tell us about that. And it's called Unconquered. Because the Seminoles were the only Native American tribe that never kind of gave up and waved the white flag.
Really?
And but the theme is the future of Seminole historic preservation. And so this is on April 7th this year, and we really want a lot of people to come out and get an understanding of how much the Seminole tribe is doing to preserve not only their culture, but the culture of Native Americans throughout Southeast U.S. It's amazing. They have a great museum down in Big Cypress. They've got a very sophisticated archive, and they're doing tremendous things, and nobody knows about it. So we want to bring that out to the Sarasota community.
Yeah, because, speak to a bit, I've done some reading. I studied history. That's what my undergraduate degree is. But, share a bit about the economic value of historic preservation, because a lot of people may think that, that's kind of nice, but there's actually quite a big boost to the community, isn't there, when we preserve historic sites?
Well, there are a lot of different ways that this comes out, and cultural or heritage tourism is one of them. Certainly there are people who enjoy traveling Florida and going to all the historic sites. There's also benefits to preserving historic buildings. And there's some communities that are really taking advantage of this. Venice is one of them. Venice is all about the history. And so it's got this charm that makes it different.
Yeah.
And they value that history as part of their economic well-being. Then you're up against rising property values. And, I think you'd mentioned earlier about, Florida maybe not doing enough for historic preservation, but part of that is the tremendous growth in Florida and trying to save the best stuff while some stuff has to go because, things are changing in Florida.
Yeah, I remember when, the Ritz was built downtown, there was a big discussion about Ringling Towers, and some people
Right.
felt it should be saved and others felt, well, we need to make room. And that always seems to be kind of a tension in Florida. What are we going to keep? And how do you decide? I mean, what do you think about that? How should we be looking to preserve history here?
Well, the way I look at it is oftentimes what are those most essential parts of our history, whether it's land, whether it's a structure, whether it's a story that needs to get told, that are part of our community identity and that we should try to keep them at almost all costs. And then if we keep those, then we'll still have our identity. But if we don't keep those, places like Snook Haven on the Mayaca River, there's only one in the world. So let's preserve that for what it is. Places like historic Spanish Point. There's no place in the west coast of Florida with so much history packed into so small of a place.
Right.
So let's keep our eye on that and make sure that's something that's available for the community and helps to enrich the community as we move forward. But I think that people want a sense of place. People coming to the area, learn a little bit about the history, they feel more at home here.
Yeah.
And I think that's a big part of it too. Whether that's the history of sports, whether it's the history of the beaches, whether it's the history of the communities, or even the names of the streets, which really people get curious about. And that starts their kind of history, curiosity, adventure when they start saying, John, who's this street name for?
Yeah, I didn't know that John Gillespie was a golfer, and that the first golf course, like Gillespie Park, was actually a small golf course in downtown Sarasota.
Well, actually, it was the area of Courthouse Subdivision that was the golf course, running out toward Ringling, the old Ringling Shopping Center, from where the post office is downtown.
Okay.
So that was the golf course running out through there, and they've got maps that show all the holes laid out over that part of downtown. So yeah, 1905, he built that course, and that was years after he started playing golf here, which was back in the 1880s.
Yeah, so is there an archive at Historic Spanish Point, or, maps and things like that?
Well,
that people
that's
can...
not our purpose. I mean, we have our own collection of items that relate specifically to the site that we use in our interpretation, but we don't intend to be the community archive because that exists, housed by Sarasota County government. So they have the archive. There's also a wonderful archive down in Venice that's operated by the city of Venice, and between those two, they house probably 90% of the historical materials, and then you have other historical societies and other groups like us that have little bits and pieces of it. It all goes together, it kind of forms that tapestry of community history.
Yeah, so your boat tours at Historic Spanish Point of Little Sarasota Bay, for the audience who may not be familiar, what's that like, getting on the boat and touring the bay?
Well, for one thing, you're getting on a reproduction of one of the first power boats in Sarasota.
Yeah, and maybe we can show that image if we have it of your boat
So this
tours.
was built by our volunteers a couple of years ago and actually launched in 2006. So we've been giving tours now for over 10 years. And when you go out, first of all, you get to see the massiveness of the shell mounds because you're looking right at them. And then Little Sarasota Bay is gorgeous. So you've got dolphins in the bay, you got manatees, you got ospreys flying overhead almost all the time. Of course, it's osprey, right?
Right,
So you'd expect to see the ospreys. We went out on a little boat trip a couple of weeks ago, saw 7 roseate spoonbills, saw this huge either manta ray or cow ray or something come out of the water, just probably 8-foot wingspan of this big ray came out of the water ahead of us. Saw a couple of different dolphins, saw ospreys the whole time we were out all fishing.
It's
pretty
history,
cool.
but there's an amazing nature component.
Well, yeah, I
with-
mean, our organization was formed back in the 1980s to educate youth and adults about history and nature. And so our focus is on the history, but history is built upon natural systems as well. But
Yeah.
the boat trip is just a great way to get out on the water. It's about 45 minutes, only takes 6 passengers at a time. It's like $12 extra on top of your admission, and people love it. And it's
Yeah.
just a great way to, it's probably the cheapest boat rental in town.
And it's
And,
a historic boat. But
It's a
before
historic boat.
we just have a few minutes. So
Yeah.
what is the phone number and the website for
Sure.
people to?
So the website is historicspanishpoint.org.
Okay.
And the phone number is 941-966-5214. And so there's a lot on our website that people can see. The boat tours and some of the other tours are subject to weather and tides and things like that. So
Yeah.
people are frustrated. They can't just sign up online. Just give us a call. We'll get you set up, get you out there, keep it safe, and everybody will have a good time.
Yeah, when I saw it, because the boat is an actual wooden replica
Correct.
of the boat that was used.
Back in 1900, from about 1900 until when it was destroyed by the 1921 hurricane. That would
Yeah.
have taken people to and from Sarasota, from the railroad to the hotel, taken people out fishing. I found an article recently where in 1917, the Magic boat went 7 miles out into the Gulf fishing.
Wow.
No cell phone, no radio, no Loran, no nothing, just out there having fun.
So if you want to experience old Florida, historic Spanish Point is
Yeah.
a place to go. And John, how long now have you been the executive director there?
Almost 3 years, and
Yeah.
it's a delight because, of course, I'm in my element. But mostly, I like being the spokesperson for the organization because there's so much there for people to learn and enjoy about Sarasota and this part of Florida. And I think that Florida story is important to tell, and this is one of the greatest places to do it.
It surely is. I have to say, I'm excited to go out there. I've
Yeah.
lived here for 20 years. I've never been. But every time I go there, it's been an amazing thing to hear from you how much is beyond just
Yeah.
the storefront, so to speak, you know, because we see that schoolhouse on Osprey, and I think, gosh, I'd like to go there, but it's really a wealth of many facilities, isn't
Yes,
it?
yes.
Yeah.
It's about the
So-
property and the site and the relationship with Little Sarasota Bay.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you. I want to thank you for
Thank
the
you.
work that you do, John. It's an amazing, the amazing energy you bring to the project. And so for those of you who want to support Historic Spanish Point, check out their luncheon, their website.
Yeah.
It's in April coming up. Thanks so much for watching, everyone. Bye-bye.
The time really flew. We bid you adieu from community. If you want to know why we love it here, so check out Community. Well, it's a who's who, a what's, when, and where show. It's a mover and shakers who care show.